This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
The programme, we have this sort of session as ending at 5 o'clock. I think that's a typo. We'll compromise at 5:15. I've been sort of nipping in and out of these sessions, I'm afraid. I've just been giving a presentation on the Institute to the board of the School of Advanced Study, and I seem to spend my whole life doing these kind of corporate presentations. And it sort of reminded me of when I was an undergraduate, and my tutor, Angus McIntyre, who was also sort of turned into a kind of university administrator, he sort of came into a tutorial once, sat down, lit a cigarette, which you then could do, sort of leaned back on his chair, obviously having been to a very long, boring meeting, and he said, "Right, let's do some history." And I've often felt that at various points in my life. And I feel it this afternoon. Like, let's do some history. And we've got three outstanding historians here who will give their thoughts on the day's events, and then we'll throw it open for your final comments. Three extraordinarily prolific authors. So I won't even attempt to list what they've all done. Professor David Killingray is a leading expert on Africa in the two world wars and missionary activity in Africa, but on a series of other topics as well. And if you haven't already got a copy, then by Fighting for Britain, African Soldiers in the Second World War.
Coming out in paperback in
right.
2 weeks' time.
Exactly.
Copy is late.
Karl is one of the UK's leading experts on Malaysia, Southeast Asia, and the Cold War in Southeast Asia in general, and indeed was the leading academic consultant on Jeremy Paxman's Empire documentary.
You've done it now, we better go.
and lived to tell the tale. Simon Smith, as far as I can see, has written books on just about everything. On Kuwait, he edited the British Documents End of Empire volume on Malta. He's written on Britain's relations with the Malay rulers, and written an outstanding general history of British imperialism. So, let's maybe we could kick off with.
We've agreed.
Oh, okay, we've agreed. So, who's going first then?
I think first we go.
Okay, Simon, right, Simon, please.
Well, really, I've just got a few comments about indirect rule in mainly Malaya, which we haven't heard too much about yet today, and I'll say a few things about South Arabia as well by point of comparison, if I may. So hopefully it might illuminate some of the earlier papers we've heard. So, although more commonly associated with British policy towards the array of kings, emirs and chiefs that Britain encountered in Africa, as we heard earlier, indirect rule found echoes in Britain's approach to the 9 Malay states. Indeed, some early British administrators, most notably Sir Frank Swetnam, claimed that the residential system developed in Malaya in the late 19th century was in fact the precursor to indirect rule in Africa. When Britain began to expand her Malayan empire in the second half of the 19th century, she did so through the agency of the Malay rulers or sultans. On the 20th of January 1874, the governor of the Straits Settlements, Sir Andrew Clark, concluded the Treaty of Pankor with the Sultan of Perak. Now, under the terms of this treaty, the Sultan agreed to, quote, receive and provide a suitable residence for a British officer to be called resident who shall be accredited to his court, and whose advice must be asked and acted upon on all questions other than those touching Malay religion and custom. Despite paying lip service to the notion of the Malay Sultan's sovereignty, the British increasingly assumed direct control of the states drawn into the residency system. For example, the first British resident in Perak, a man called J.W.W. Birch, he declared, quote, "With the Sultan, one must be firm and even peremptory. Sultan Abdullah will be a puppet and do all that one advises." As these sentiments suggest, the residency system, soon extended to the states of Selangor, Pahang and Negeri Sembilan, was only nominally indirect. An even greater degree of British control was achieved when these four states were brought together in the mid-1890s to form the Federated Malay States, or FMS. This structure became highly centralised, real power resting in the hands of the agent of the British government, at first called the Resident General and subsequently the Chief Secretary. Writing in the 1930s, the Harvard professor Rupert Emerson observed, quote, "The Federation was in reality only nominally federal in character. Basically, it was a new state constructed over the heads of the four existing states to protect and advance the interests of the new alien population." Comparing in 1896 the position of the Malay Sultans under Siamese and British rule, King Chulalongkorn of Siam noted, quote, "For the Europeans, their system elevates the ruler of any tributary to the high position of a demigod who does almost nothing." Unsurprisingly, criticism of this situation was not slow in materialising. Referring in 1903 to the Federated Malay States, of which his state was one, Sultan Idris of Perak observed, quote, "A Malay proverb says, there cannot be two masters and one vessel, neither can there be four rulers over one country." Now, the rulers of the five so-called unfederated Malay states, which remained outside the Federation, enjoyed much more genuine autonomy and independence. And their experience perhaps conformed more closely to the ideal of indirect rule. Appropriately, the British officers in the unfederated Malay states were termed advisors rather than residents. And in 1920, the Chief Secretary of the Federated Malay States, a man called Sir George Maxwell, went so far as to suggest that, quote, "The difference between the ruler of an unfederated state and a ruler of one of the federated states is that one rules his country and the other does not." Even the British recognised that the system of government introduced into the federated Malay states had become too centralised and spent much of the interwar years trying, largely in vain, to untangle the constitutional knots on the Malayan Peninsula. The shock to the imperial system dealt by the Japanese invasion and subsequent occupation of Southeast Asia during the Second World War prompted British policymakers to put Malaya on a new path which decisively rejected the tenets of indirect rule. Now, a tangible link between planning for Africa and Malaya can be identified with respect to Lord Hailey's influence on both territories. In his celebrated African Survey, which was of course published in 1938, Lord Hailey looked forward to a time when the African colonies would be moving towards self-government. In so doing, he came to question the rectitude of continuing to maintain the policy of indirect rule. For example, Hailey wrote, quote, "There is much that is difficult to foresee in the future of indirect rule, but possibly the most difficult problem of all is to envisage the feasibility of integrating the system with the normal type of parliamentary institutions." Against the background of the loss of the Malay states, Paley was asked by the Colonial Office to comment on reconstruction of Malaya after the war. Paley responded by questioning whether the system in the Malay states was capable of being adjusted to the promotion of self-governing institutions, advocating instead Britain's acquisition of undisputed rights of jurisdiction throughout this area as a prelude to the emasculation of the Sultan's sovereignty and the creation of a new constitution, the Malayan Union, encompassing all the Malay states. Paley's criticisms of the unprogressive nature of indirect rule in Africa found echoes in his criticisms of the facade of Sultan rule in Malaya. Paley's views on indigenous rulers in Africa and Malaya also converged with respect to his strictures on the development of representative institutions. In both Africa and Malaya, Paley saw indirect rule and preparation for self-government as incompatible with one another. On the one hand, he perceived that it would be difficult to integrate traditional rulers into more democratic structures, while on the other he feared that a progressive relaxation of British control might lead simply to autocratic rule by these rulers. Certain similarities between wartime planning for Africa and Malaya in relation to traditional rulers can be perceived, therefore. Nevertheless, the Malayan Union was more radical and more clearly defined by the end of the war than any comparable policy towards African rulers. The fact that the African colonies remained under British control throughout the war meant that planning had to take account of local views, and as a result was more circumspect than that which had been formulated in London for Malaya. The planners of the Malayan Union, by contrast, were liberated from local restraints and consultations by the Japanese occupation. This allowed them to concoct a radical scheme which no doubt local opinion would have challenged had it been able to do so. Ironically, at the very time that indirect rule was being decisively rejected with respect to Malaya, it was being reasserted in southern Arabia. This is all the more noteworthy since the advisory treaties which Britain had begun signing with the indigenous rulers of South Arabia in the late 1930s in order to consolidate its regional presence were based on those already concluded with the Malay sultans. In 1944, the governor of Aidan, Sir John Hawthorne Hall, asserted that, quote, in an extension of this system of indirect rule, under which, fortified by the presence of a small force of government guards, a political officer or assistant political official stands behind the local treaty chief and guides his policy while supporting his prestige and authority, lies the only hope of a successful political, social and economic development of the Western Aidan Protectorate. In keeping with Hall's prescription, Britain began to extend the advisory treaties which it had already secured with the sultans of Makalla and Seon in Eastern Aidan Protectorate to the rulers of the Western Aidan Protectorate. While such a policy had the advantage of minimising British colonial liabilities in the region, it did necessitate the protection of the existing rulers. This became even more pronounced with the formation of the British-sponsored Federation of Western Aidan Protectorate States in 1959 that we heard about earlier this morning. However, the closeness of the relationship between the rulers and the British in South Arabia arguably left the former open to the charge of being agents of imperialism. As one Yemeni official put it, they came to be seen as British selected chiefs of, quote, the day before yesterday. Indeed, the eclipse of the rulers of southern Arabia in 1967 can be ascribed, in some senses, to the fact that they became too closely associated with the British imperial regime in the era of decolonisation and Arab nationalism. The rulers of the Malay states, by contrast, threw in their lots with the emerging nationalists in post-war Malaya, which I think Karl might be talking about later. And against all expectations, the Malay rulers have survived to this day as sources of political and social influence in contemporary Malaysia. I think that I should say.
Thank you very much indeed.
Karl.
Okay, and now for something slightly different. I will talk about Malaysia a bit. What I really want to do, because I'm slightly different from everyone else. I'm really an Asian specialist, not Africa or the Arabian Peninsula. And really I do more direct rule than indirect rule. I do a lot of counterinsurgency and quite brutal stuff. So what I wanted to do is play off some of what's gone and bring out a few ideas and questions that occurred to me. The first concerns the very title of indirect rule. And people were saying, was it a good thing or a bad thing? Does it ossify structures or change them? It struck me that one way of doing this is to reframe what we're thinking about. Because I'm not sure it is always about direct or indirect rule. And surely all governments have to have local people who have some sort of power. What is the differentiation here? And it struck me maybe we need to go back and read Weber and think of the difference between bureaucratic rule and personal rule. And that's what we're really talking about. And when you talk about personal rule, in terms of the native authorities, again, there are different ways, and you can see them coming out. In some cases, it's a traditional personal rule. It's almost feudal, it's inherited, it's respected, it's culturally embedded. In others, as we see in certain areas of Uganda, as I'll talk about in a minute, such as Bukedi, well, the native authorities are not local at all. And they're not charismatic either. They're taking a cut of the tax, and they're not very popular at certain stages, and they set off riots in response. So maybe we need to rephrase it and think what actually matters is what sort of rule is this? And is the real issue that there's a failure at some point to move from personal rule to slightly more bureaucratization, and from, in some places, not others, from personal rule of people who are relatively uneducated and not given the modern tools, to other areas, such as Malaysia, where actually these people who are involved as native authorities, you know, the sultans, their families, are sent to what's called the Eton of the East, Malay College Kuala Kangsar, and they're given the same education as at Eton. Is that a good thing? No. They're given that kind of British public school ethos and system. They're given modern tools. They're put in the Malay administrative service, and some of them become district officers. You know, they're on both sides of the curve. So maybe it's those sorts of questions we need to think about as well in judging what indirect rule is doing. And I'm avoiding saying whether it's good or bad because I want to get out alive. And I don't have a considered opinion. I just think, how do we frame it? And that's an important question. A second is what I'm going to call the Aidan Question, inspired by what went on earlier. I enjoyed the papers, and it struck me the Aidan Question that came up. In other words, the question in a very good paper that wasn't addressed was why and how do the local native rulers, even some who may appear traditional, start to lose it? Start to lose the support of local people? Is that because of factionalism, outside ideology, because they become inevitably tainted by the touch of the imperialist in a 20th century decolonising world? What is going on? Again, Malaysia raises this question quite interestingly. Simon told you the story, and it's quite an odd one, because actually in 1945 to 46, when the British come back to Malaya, and they said, we've had enough of indirect rule. 13 pathetic little territories get overrun by the Japanese, we have to support them, and they're a mess. And they won't give the Chinese any citizenship. We can't have this. We want a modern, united territory with a unified citizenship. And they forced the Malay sultans to sign away their sovereignty. They literally sign away. So how on earth are they there later? Well, the answer, of course, is that it's not just that they throw their lot in with the national, so I think that is it. It's the Malay response to that is, actually, we have to form a Malay association that fights for Malay rights, Malay identity. That actually indirect rule is vital. We were never a colony. You can't do this. We can't become a Malayan union. we are a federation and our sultans have sovereignty. So ironically what happens is in 1948, when you get the Malays persuade the British to make it the Malayan Federation, the sultans are given sovereignty in their individual states back and are made protectors of Malay rights, symbols of Malay identity, and secondly, again Simon is right, some of them, the younger generation and so on, actually joined the main nationalist party and fight amongst themselves as to who will help lead it. That's the Aidan question, is that why do some native authorities start to lose power? Others manage to gain it, keep it, regain it. Then there's what you might call the Uganda question. I enjoyed the Uganda paper particularly because I've just edited a paper by a colonial policeman, Andrew Stewart, who talked about the Bukedi riots. And according to him, this is in 1960 when the poll tax is increased in this particular province of Uganda. And in addition, the local native authority chiefs are not local at all. They're Bugandans, and I think somebody else mentioned, who've been brought in and are possibly taking a cut and not very popular. And there are riots in which some of their huts are burned and so on. It does raise the question again as to just who these native authorities are. How is their authority constructed? You know, it struck me with the debate earlier, there was something else going on. Somebody said that you couldn't have outsiders, you know, it had to be locals. Well, of course, first of all, they're not always locals. Secondly, certain other branches of the colonial state in an indirect rule situation actually do move people around. The colonial police in Malaya, for instance, when it's indirectly ruled, cannot go to their own district. It's not allowed. Admittedly, no one will marry them then. They won't give their daughters to them for various reasons. But that's a more bureaucratic solution. Different things are going on. So there is that Uganda question. I'm going to put a little appeal or advertisement in here. I don't think anyone can stop me. As I say, we put one working paper from a colonial policeman talking about Uganda on our Ferguson Centre website, Ferguson Centre for African and Asian Studies at the Open University. Now, I wouldn't say we want everything and anything, but I certainly heard one or two papers here which gave either fascinating accounts of people's perspective on the good and the bad of indirect rule or particular case studies, where I'd be quite happy to talk to them about whether they might want to put that in a more written form and show them our website and see what we've already done for somebody else. And in addition, I hope eventually to use some of that for teaching material, because we use primary sources for our course on Empire, which has 800 students a year, and I'd like them to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak. I think that's probably about enough. I mean, the Malaysian case, I have one thing I'll toss in at the end. I don't want to go on about decolonization too much. So I think the remaining question, the remaining Malayan question for me, that for obvious reasons we haven't brushed up on much here, is what the personal nature of the actor is that makes this relationship work, both from the perspective of the British resident advisor and the local sultan or emir. You know, in Malaya it's quite often the first resident, and Simon talked about the 1874 treaty, the first resident, Birch, I think speaks no or poor Malay, really annoys the local aristocracy and ends up with a spear up his backside. He's replaced by a man who learns Malay. You know, a lot of these British advisors in the first 20, 30 years are very much scholar administrators. They learn the language. There are one or two of these scholar administrators who stay on afterwards, in one or two cases become Muslim. I suppose they do go native in some cases. So there's clearly that side. And on the Malaysian side, I want to finish with the Sultan of Johor's palace, partly just because I love it, and partly because it says something. The Johor Sultanate, which is one of these states, starts off not as a sultanate at all. It's the Temenggung, it's the junior official under the sultan, who goes across the causeway from Singapore and Johor and says, I'd like this as a state, I'll set up. And he practices indirect rule of his own. He gets Chinese, he gives them concessions, he lets them revenue farm, and he builds up a state, and the British first recognise him as Maharaja, then they recognise him as Sultan. Then he builds this wonderful palace, and you have to go there if you want to see the inside of the head of a man or a family who think they are the ultimate indirect rulers. You go into their china cabinet, and they've gone to Staffordshire and got the finest pottery and decorate it with Islamic presents. You go into the reception room, you can't see all of this now, something's moved. The biggest genealogy in the world, not quite Sultan of Brunei's is bigger, traces back through various half-godlike creatures through Alexander the Great, proves his legitimacy. Stories of how he learnt Islam on his father's lap. You know, this is a Malay traditional ruler. Next to this genealogy, which is bigger than that panel, was that big invitation to a garden party in Buckingham Palace. Lots of property in London, perfect Victorian, Malay, Islamic gentleman, existing in two worlds and manipulating both. I just leave you with that thought as to kind of what makes these relationships work, what's it like to live inside the head of the emir sheikh and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dave.
Well, Simon and Karl have both confessed their Asian Oriental credentials. Looking around here, I know that most people have field service in Africa, and as the almost lone African specialist, I feel as if I'm surrounded by hyenas about to descend on me. Anything I say will be critically examined, and I'll be told afterwards it wasn't like that on my patch. But let me start with, I've got 4 points. The first is necessity. We've heard that a lot, the necessity of having indirect rule, native administration, or the expediency. I think it's fairly early. Let's take the 6th of March 1844, when the Gold Coast, there is a chief's sign with the company representatives on the coast, and that becomes a very important date in the Gold Coast. So much so that when Nkrumah is looking around for the date for independence in 1957, it's the 6th of March. So Gold Coast history under the British is partly shaped in the coastal area by that kind of significance, which delivers to the Gold Coast a degree of native authority, which is fairly lightly controlled by the British. After all, if you are thin on the ground, as the British were, then you are concerned to protect generally law and order, but there's a large amount of law and order that you police rather differently from that which directly affects your immediate interests, which is where the few Europeans live, perhaps, or where the centres of administration are. Zanzibar is another example of earlier system of rule, which is under an indigenous ruler, with the British standing there with a consul directing John Kirk. I think it would be quite instructive to look at the way in which African rulers come to Britain in the 19th and early 20th centuries and their reception. Even Ketweo comes to Britain in 1881. This is the man who has been responsible for defeating a British force, badly led and poorly deployed, at Isfandwana. He is treated with great respect by the London crowds. There are rhymes made up about him. Quite respectable rhymes, actually. He's not a man who's seen as an enemy, he's seen as a man who's a great warrior. Now, there's a whole succession of these African rulers who are the people that are going to be entrusted with native administration, either at the time or later. For example, in 1895-96, the Tuam chiefs come to London. And again, they're lionised and feted, and they're taken around and they're photographed, and there are these respectable-looking gentlemen. They're black, but in top hats and those long, heavy coats. So it's a very interesting picture of the way in which African rulers, who are seen as being the legitimate rulers of Africa, are treated by the colonial office and the early colonial rulers. I'll come back to that in a minute, but let me take a second point, periodization. I mentioned this earlier, and I think it's rather important. And native administration, I think one has to put against the background of economic development or undevelopment or non-development in Africa. The revenue that was available to governments and the demands on expenditure. And if we took the period, it's rather a long period, but let's say from about 1880 through to 1914, this is a laissez-faire period, and much of the expenditure, based on the relatively small amount of revenue that is raised, I leave South Africa out of this, the 4 colonies of South Africa, is spent on the consolidation of power on what can loosely be called law and order, ensuring that you have frontiers. And of course those are in a way arbitrary, they're agreed with other European states, and they are often related to questions of power in Europe rather than questions of power in Africa. And then comes the First World War. It's disruptive. There's relatively little investment in Africa in that period. But there is increase in African rule as Europeans are withdrawn and Africans move back into places from which they have been usurped. And this is true in church as well as state. And then the 1920s and the 1930s. This is a period when there is a low level of government intervention in any case, and also of low investment, particularly in the late 20s and through the early 30s. So that by 1938, revenues are 10% lower. And you can see right across Africa, it is a decimation, using the word correctly, of both officials and of expenditure. And then we have the Second World War. And the Second World War is distorted, but it also does promote some economic development in Africa. And if we can look at the Second World War, then it doesn't just end in August 1945. It's got a long tail. Even bringing soldiers home from India is a process which takes through to 1947, because they are accorded a low level of significance in terms of post-war reconstruction. And so by 1950, on the back of the Development Acts and so on, which 1940, 45, 1950, quite remarkable acts in many ways, and for the French, Fidesz, you do begin to have investment and what John Lonsdale has called the second colonial occupation of Africa, where welfare specialists with their various policies in agriculture, education, hospital and health move in. But clearly for the colonial power, and you see this in France as well as in Britain, there are questions being raised, who's going to pay for this? This is an expensive process. Now, I think that native administration, as it's called, has to be seen against that kind of economic backdrop. And if you don't do that, you're removing one of the vital elements, which is there to finance investment, the revenue of the state. And you're looking to have administration on the cheap. So, as someone said, it's not only necessitous, it was expedient, but it was also economical. Let me come to a third point, the shapers of native administration. Clearly, men, it's interesting, they are men, overwhelmingly. I have a very feisty wife, and I have 3 very feisty daughters. And I often wonder what Africa would have been like if it had been administered by women rather than men. It's not an outrageous idea, but I tend to think that women often are much better at some of the things that men have arrogated to themselves. But it is primarily men. It's maybe men here, because you are the products of a system that is beginning to change after 1945, but with glacial slowness. What about the role of the men on the ground? How to do it? And we've heard about Karl and Cameron, but also what was rather interesting in some of the presentations was people saying, well, we did it this way here because that seemed a reasonable thing to do. And I suspect a lot of that goes on under native administration in Africa. You worked it out, what was practical and reasonable, given what you knew as a field officer or people knew within the district, and to what you could sustain. But I think behind this there's another element, particularly about the big shapers, the Lugards and the Cowards. And it's this sense of the idealisation of rulers, the natural rulers, of course, who are largely men. It's hierarchical, and it's tied in with ideas of imperial hierarchies. The rituals of empire that you probably all engage in, Empire Day or the birthday of the monarch or whatever, has been written about in considerable detail by some scholars. And it's a fascinating picture of how you tried to focus loyalty on the person of the monarch. And you could also do that on the local ruler as well. So imperial hierarchies are quite important. And if we're looking at those who shaped native administration, it's probably also useful, and we had this a little bit in the first session, the critics of native administration, particularly those who were critical from the 1920s onwards as to what was going on in northern Nigeria, creating and sustaining a feudal system. And the more prescient, and there are a few prescient voices, argued that this is the wrong way to go. And that if you go in this direction, you're propping up something really that you should be trying to change. A few voices like that. And then my last point is, and I've already mentioned it before, and it's about the end of native administration and opposition to it from anti-colonial political parties. And these are parties which have the aim of taking over power at the centre. In other words, taking the place of the colonial rulers. Therefore, they are not tolerant of anything which gives control to the provinces and to local centres of possible rival power. And that leads all over Africa to areas of political dispute. And in many ways, I think we've been the victims of those who wrote the nationalist history of Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. I mean, some of it's splendid work, but it was top down often, not very much bottom up. So we knew about who was in charge and what they were trying to impose, but not about the way in which it was received. And it ignored the rival forces, which are political. In other words, it seemed to me that much of that nationalist history was a limited view of politics. Rather than the way that politics is often written about here in Britain. You know, it's top down, it's about the parties, but it's not about the Residents' Association and the farmers' group and the Countryside Alliance who have got political agendas that they're pursuing. And it gets lost because the top down is easier to look at. And I think this has been true for Africa as well. But someone did say, well, perhaps we should have another conference on looking at the end of colonial rule and the way in which the so-called nationalist parties opposed native administration and how that played out.
Thank you very much indeed. Very well. We've got about half an hour. I'm sure there'll be lots of people who want to respond to these points. So please keep your interventions fairly brief, and again, speak up so we can get it all on records. Please, yeah.
Yes, it's true that the advisory treaties with the sultans and sheikhs of South Arabia had the tendency to isolate them from their people and to bring down on them the wrath of nationalism. And yet, they were the right people to deal with. They were the right people to make the treaties with. Had we maintained confidence, had we wanted to continue that, they could have survived that criticism. Don't forget that the Egyptian propaganda, brilliant that it was a pure chivalric. When we went, the Egyptians had prepared the way for an atheist communist regime to take over. And it didn't just bump off Exel towns. The story of Mohammed Idris is very germane. There were two major failures when we were bringing together the Federation of South Arabia. We lost two big fish. One was the Sultan of Lahej, Ali Abdul Karim, and the second was Mohammed Idris, an idealistic young man who was descended from an immensely ancient family at the heart of the Yafai Confederation, which was like a sword sticking deep into the middle of the proposed federation. He led an honourable campaign against the British, was eventually obliged to withdraw beyond the frontier, came back at independence. His people said, stay where you are and see what, when he came back to his own capital, and see what's cooking down there. He said no, he was going and join the revolution, days of sultans over, and they got him and they shot him with all his relations. It was a very hard situation for our rulers.
Thank you. I think I'd like to, if you don't mind, I think a lot of people want to come in. So there's a gentleman at the back who wants to talk.
Keith Stewart. I've been described as an amateur historian. I'd like you to take it on trust that that refers to my absence of remuneration rather than perhaps the quality of anything I produce. I've got a good collection of colonial office lists. And when I look through it, particularly in the 20s and the 30s, I see how many people there were on the ground. And having listened very attentively today to a lot of people who served as district officers, I'm getting the feeling that the further you were away from the centre of the power of the governor's residence, the further you were away from the railway, the more that indirect rule was practised, with a district officer perhaps running an area the size of north of England and only a doctor 100 miles away. Whereas when you get to the main regional cities, I mean, you've, as well as, say, something like a country like Nigeria, you've got maybe 300 colonial officers, but you've got a couple of hundred people running the railway. You've got the accounts department, you've got the audit department, you've got 100 doctors, you've got 50 nurses, you've got the public works department, you've got the engineering department, you've got the forestry department. Now, I know Nigeria is big. I think people have suggested it's perhaps 30 times the size of the British Isles. But it occurs to me that there is an element of rule that affects every person of the indigenous to that country, that affects their life in a major way. And it's not just the power of the hands-on administration, but it's supplying everything. It's supplying the water. I mean, even district officers were persuading engineers to come and dig an artesian well in their area. So I go back to summarize. I think the indirect rule was practiced more precisely, far away from the administration, in the bush, in the bundu. But where you were in a major town, although of course not a major town by present day standards, I think there were so many aspects of colonial administration that impinged on everyone's life.
Thank you very much. Please.
Lang Brown, Uganda, up to 1963. This is a very brief, but an attempt to answer the title of today. It said it couldn't be answered, but looking back, the Belgian Congo was one of the worst examples of direct rule in Africa. There may have been others earlier, Germany, East Africa. The Congo was appalling. And when it crumbled in the course of all. We realised this when we were giving some help and supplies to the Belgian farmers, who, if they hadn't left their farms that day, they'd been shot. It disappeared completely, whereas Uganda still had many years quite comfortable, peaceful, prosperous and honest existence to go.
Thanks very much. Please.
I'm Simon Dillett. I talked about Botswana in the first session. Thinking through it, listening to everyone thinking through it, seems to me that we must distinguish between the colonies of British settlement, South Africa, Southern Rhodesia, where the administrators were appointed locally. There's a world of difference between the way they're run and the way the territories, including Bechuanaland and Kenya, were run by administrators from London. Can we not give direct rule to Southern Rhodesia and South Africa on behalf of the white population and indirect rule to everything else?
Yes.
David Killingray talked about the rituals of empire and hierarchy and so on. And it doesn't altogether surprise me that we should be looking to local rulers like the sultans and so on as the people through whom we would exercise influence. Because when you go back before the war and look at British newspapers, that's how we were governed. All we were doing was something really quite similar in our own mentality abroad. After all, the first election in the UK, which was one person, one vote, was I think in 1950. Until 1986, in my own county, nobody ever voted for the chairman of the county council because he was always returned unopposed. So I'm not in the least bit surprised that we should be using the sultans and so on, because that was to quite a large extent how we operated at home. The other point I'd like to make is that it's pretty clear from the conversations we've had that in indirect rule, one size didn't fit all. And all we were doing within this general sort of philosophy was tailoring individual arrangements to individual countries. And I'm particularly struck, nobody's mentioned the British colonies in the Mediterranean, for example, where we gave internal self-government, direct rule if you like, to Malta as early as 1920, I think. And Gibraltar ruled itself in effect, and so did Cyprus, more or less. And I'm intrigued that the only colonial pensions ever paid to Maltese, as far as I can see, were for them serving in our colonies abroad, not to Maltese in their own country. So it was very much tailoring things to very, very different examples.
Simon, would you like to comment on the Mediterranean?
It's an interesting case study.
Perhaps you haven't read the book Blue Water Empire.
I think, I don't know whether the Colonial Office would have used the term indirect rule to describe their practices in Malta in the interwar years and beyond. I think that's the only problem I have with your influence there. Might be a diarchal system, how they would describe things. But I think in the context of our discussion today, I don't think it fits the Colonial Office definition, although of course there are, as we've seen, different definitions, but I don't think it would fit the umbrella definition of indirect rule. How would you like to
it strikes me that there's just one slight point we are slightly missing. I mean, it's not really a good bad thing, but just that it does make a big difference in certain cases, and the Malay one's a key one. Your sole legal justification for being there, very, very definitely, is that you were given permission to have a resident who advises. So, what British do in 46 and try and get rid of the sultans accept as titular is actually quite shocking legally. And I think the same probably goes for Uganda, that actually where a treaty is very well entrenched and legal, it's actually quite difficult to change it. The only other thing I'd say is I don't know about the Northern Mediterranean, but I do think you have to look at what the nature of this rule is locally. I mean, to a degree, if it's meritocratic and it's salaried officials and it works the same as any other bureaucratic place, that looks very different from African, or some cases of African indirect rule to me. That just looks like local government. I think there are other issues that we do need to think about. The nature of someone with very personal authority to arrest someone, try them in court or whatever, who isn't salaried in quite the same way. I know it changes over time. But that's a different sort of power. It's not just to do with being indirect. I think it's possibly a more capricious sort of power.
I'll let David respond, then take another round of questions.
It wasn't uncommon to have people, say, from the Caribbean who worked in West Africa and who were colonial officials, and also people who were born in Cyprus or Malta who served in West Africa and East Africa. I mean, they crop up there as army officers and as officials. One or two quite distinguished Maltese people who serve in the colonial service and go on to be senior positions in the government.
What about Egypt?
Just
Egypt.
Well,
would you like to comment on that, David?
What, just the word Egypt?
Seems to me it's a great example of indirect rule.
No, I draw a line through the sand.
Okay, Jonathan, Peter, then this gentleman.
David Killingray mentioned top-down. I think that there is a perception in this country that we were about laying down the law. And I think that's wrong. We did not. We were not like the French who were trying to turn the people they were colonizing into Frenchmen, or we were not shoving our culture and our language down the throats of locals. I think that's very clear to me, and I think some academics and historians have got that very, very wrong. It seems to me that the fact that we did not, I'm not saying that Africans, I think on the whole, Africans are very receptive and very, in some ways, great learners. And it seems to me that our foresight has paid off, because I don't think Africans now like the idea of that. For instance, in French-speaking Africa, they were not able to be themselves to the same extent that they were able to be themselves in British Africa, and they are happier for that and are making faster progress because of that, and that's one of our great legacies.
Thank you. Yeah, just do.
You may be right, Jonathan, within a limited compass, but if we take the early years of colonial rule, law and order is one of the elements that you'll see writ in every colonial territory. And linked to that is how do you collect revenue? And you collect revenue with an element of force. So the military is there for two purposes. It's there to maintain law and order, but it's also there to ensure that revenue is collected. And it sounds nasty, and I think it was nasty. And much of the early period of colonial rule, where you are contesting territory and you're fighting people with superior weaponry, sometimes it doesn't always work to your advantage. Opposition can be long drawn out, as amongst the Nandi, for example, but nevertheless, it is superior firepower. Now, it's not talking about a period that you have administered, it's talking about it in the historical compass of colonialism. And it was to seize territory. And in my book, that was arbitrary and it was wrong.
Peter.
Yes, one or two rather random thoughts, actually. But, first of all, it was occurring to me, because the early experiment in indirect rule in Africa was very much with the chartered companies. This was a brilliant wheeze, thought the British government, would cost us nothing. The British South Africa Company never paid a dividend until 1924. And colonial rule in that sense in Northern Rhodesia was extremely short. I mean, I interviewed an official who had been appointed by the British South Africa Company in 1919. and was still there in 1964. So that's one little point. The other point about sort of status was that one governor of Northern Rhodesia, I think, said that the Tunga Virotzilan, the paramount chief, was the only African whose hand he shook in the entire territory. Periodization, I think, is important. I think the 20th century colonial empire was a wonderful workshop of constitutional experimentation. I mean, for example, you mentioned British local government. Now, in Ceylon in 1931, the Donmore Constitution was based on the British local government model, with with committees of finance headed by a chairman and so on, rather than a ministerial system. So everything was tried somewhere. And just one last, again, quite disassociated point. We were talking about the end of the relationship with the national parties, with the nationalist parties in the end of empire. I think the role of the governor was often a key role, again in Northern Rhodesia. Arthur Benson, who's supposed to be a brilliant cadet, was remained wedded to indirect rule until the 50s and thought that Killingray and Co were all terrorists. Whereas when Evelyn Hone came in as governor in 59, this meant that the transfer of power was an extremely amicable process between the unit leadership and the British colonial government, and there's still, I think, in Lusaka and even Home College today, which says something, doesn't it? And there's similar in Nyasaland, where Lord Devlin in 1959 said Nyasaland is, albeit temporarily, a police state, which was a terrible shock for the British to then so described, whereas Glyn James managed to strike up a good relationship with Banda and remained Governor General of Malawi for a year after independence. So I know I quite agree about the top-down, down-top, but sometimes the relationship between the men at the top should be absolutely
David, thank you. There's a question back.
Charles Bennett, Zimbabwe Republic Police till 1983 and still British South Africa Police Regimental Association. Obviously a much later generation. Just Dr. Hack mentioned colonial police manpower posting policy. I'm not sure that that's really got much to do with direct rule or indirect rule, because the Royal Irish Constabulary, I think, from its inception, services from 1922, had exactly the same policy, that you weren't allowed to serve in the country of in the county of your birth, and if you married a woman from that county, you were immediately posted somewhere else. And without going into the intricacies of whether Ireland was colonial or not, I think that's often a practical measure which has value in terms of impartiality, regardless of whether it's colonial, indirect, or other rule. And for instance, in Rhodesia, in southern Rhodesia, people generally weren't posted to their home areas. Mashona was posted to Shona-speaking areas and Tasmania to Sindebele-speaking areas for practical reasons, but within those, people were usually mixed around. I couldn't help thinking when Professor Killingray mentioned women administrators. I did a very brief stint in a commercial role in Tanzania. The only district administrators I dealt with who were efficient and had great integrity and drive and were thoroughly admirable were in fact two women. But in this case, I think it was perhaps rather because they were separate from and isolated from the local traditional patriarchal structures rather than because they were local. So perhaps they were a form of indirect rule in themselves.
Thank you.
My name's Daniel McEvoy at University of East Anglia. Not been a colonial officer, but I've been a neo-colonial officer with the Australian government in the Solomon Islands, which has been something that I've been now writing a PhD on and interviewing some former British colonial officers and also some of their Solomon Islands counterparts. And I guess the British must have done something pretty good in the Solomon Islands, because I hear that they've just recruited a British police commissioner. But that's just by way of introduction. We've heard a little bit about law and order, but not so much about justice at the local level. And it occurs to me that, or I'm wondering whether the genius, perhaps, of indirect rule, whatever that was, I'm still not quite sure after today, whether the genius of it was that in some contexts it allowed sort of informal justice processes to carry on and allow justice to be delivered locally rather than sort of tied up with formal justice mechanisms, which seem, thinking in the context of Uganda with the ICC sort of interventions there, where the local people, as far as I can tell, in northern Uganda to this day, are still a lot more relaxed about, not relaxed, I guess is the wrong word, but it seems that the informal, or the marriage of informal and formal justice mechanisms under indirect rule seems to have been an act of genius that seems to have worked very well in the Solomons. I'm wondering if it worked as well in other places. Thank you.
I was thinking about that comment that we were not there to lay down the law. I think the real question is, if we were not there to lay down the law, what were we there for? It's undoubtedly and uncomfortably for us the fact that we were there because we thought we knew better than they did. And perhaps the advantages of indirect rule was that at the same time it modified that supremacist attitude, and also to some extent concealed it in forms that were acceptable internationally. The problem seems to me to be this one that has been mentioned of what happens afterwards, after independence. And I think one of the big problems of the world at this moment is that where you've got the remains of indirect rule, whether it be in Swaziland or indeed in the Gulf states, Brunei, Saudi Arabia, for example, it does not sit happily with concepts of one man, one vote, or indeed Islamic fundamentalism. And therefore it is arguable that what was convenient and during the colonial times and reasonably effective, i.e. indirect rule, has had some pernicious effects in the world of today.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Yes.
Peter Wood, Tanzania. When I arrived in Tanzania, in Tanganyika in 1957, the population was 6 million. Now, I may have missed it, but I think just a question about population needs to be there. It's now 42 million, and that's one relatively short working life, which means, I think, that we must take ourselves back and remember what things were like when there were only 6 million people, and that the infrastructure was probably better when we were there.
Thank you. Nick, Chandra, you still want to? Yeah.
This is reference to seminar series you had at the Institute on Language Policy and Practice in the Commonwealth. One of the papers presented by an academic from University of Aberystwyth on Wales, on Welsh in the Empire and Empire in Welsh, highlights the tension between the tension in some of the churches, the Welsh churches operating in India, about the use of English and Welsh. Do you find that language was an issue at all in the areas that in the areas you searched, and also whether indirect or direct rule had any significant difference in terms of survival of local languages, or in terms of other lingua franca that we use or that could have been used?
I think we might have an immediate response.
Well, it's just that, yes, that rings a bell, because in Tanganyika, as many people will know, because it was a mandate or a trust territory, it was the policy of the government to, as the British administration, to use Swahili as the lingua franca rather than English. I mean, we operated in Swahili. I didn't operate in English. It was Swahili. The courts were in Swahili. English, I think, was only introduced to the educational level at, I think, at secondary school. I don't think it was in primary school. The consequence of that, and this is, I think, very relevant to some of the comments that have been made today, was that around the time of independence and before and just after, many of the Thai people were saying, you British, you deliberately suppressed us by not giving us the benefit of English. So, I mean, you can't win, really. We thought we were doing the right thing. Could I add, rather more general thing, really, in a way, a response to something that David Killingray said, and I know, David, you said that your reference to law and order and the force of arms, or whatever the phrase was really more about the period before our time. But after all, we're talking about indirect rule, which is really the last, what, 40, 50 years or so of empire. And I would argue that during that time, of course, there was a responsibility to maintain law and order, but I particularly wouldn't like the younger people in the room to go away with the impression that meant that, you know, we went around with guns or with the police or whatever enforcing law and order, because it actually wasn't like that. And as the former DC said on the Germany Pact, were you involved? Did somebody say you were involved?
To some extent, yeah.
Right. It's okay. What he said on that programme the night before last, I think, is a point that is very important also to this whole concept of indirect rule, because it wouldn't have worked otherwise. And he said the whole edifice, the whole way we work was based on mutual trust and mutual respect. And that was certainly my experience in the short time I was in Tanganyika. It wouldn't have worked otherwise.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that one of our panellists has a train to catch, so we have to wind things up fairly quickly. I'm just going to give the panel, members of the panel, one last chance to respond to the points that have been made. So, Karl, would you like to
take me last?
Okay.
I wasn't quite ready for that.
Well, I suppose just one point which struck me in the discussion, I think it was a point also which Karl made in his presentation, is that this issue of legitimacy, I suppose where indirect rule worked most effectively, the British were not necessarily harming the legitimacy of local rulers, whether they're in Africa or India or Southeast Asia. In fact, in some ways, are reinforcing the legitimacy of indigenous authorities. I think that the case of Aidan is an interesting one because possibly the association, very close association with the British in this era of fairly virulent sort of anti-colonialism and Arab nationalism did serve to delegitimize some of the rulers with fairly disastrous consequences. Of course, in Aidan, the rulers were very unlucky, and the British were as well. As I think you mentioned, of course, the Yemeni Revolution in 1962 was a very destabilizing element in the region. So far as the Malay sultans were concerned, which is, I suppose, the territory I'm more familiar with, I think initially, as Karl also mentioned, the treaties upon which the British rested their rule did provide the British with their legitimacy. Without the treaties, without respecting the sovereignty of the sultans, the British actually had no legal basis for their position in the Malay states. And when the British tried to revise the treaties they signed with the Malay sultans in the immediate post-war era, it actually, and try to emasculate the ruler's sovereignty, this actually served to delegitimize the British and the legitimacy of their position in the Malay states. So, I don't know, I think this whole question of legitimacy and indirect rule, I think is absolutely crucial.
Thank you very much. David.
Native authority and justice has been mentioned once or twice. In northern Nigeria, native authorities are backed by the British under the indirect rule system from the early part of the 20th century. Penal policies, although the idea of repugnance is prevalent, nevertheless there were certain things that went on that you and I, even at the time, would have regarded as repugnant. Beheading, certain kinds of execution and so on. Native authority police, which little has been said about, although it's been hinted at, are often the subject of African rulers, and therefore they act not only as the ears and eyes, but they also act as the servants of African rulers, and they're often authoritarian. I have that not from merely observing it, but colonial officials looking at the operation of native authority police and saying, this is what is something we don't want, but we have to put up with. Last point on Swahili. An African soldier in the Second World War said to the education officer, he said, I don't want to learn, I want to learn English. Swahili opens a little door. English opens a large door.
Karl.
Yeah, briefly. The language just reminds me that we're talking about lines from the British to native authority, but indirect rule also involves very much allowing particular communities or sometimes religious groups space, or integrating elements of Islam into local legal codes, as you do in Malaysia and Singapore, because otherwise you're going to have real trouble. And interestingly, in Malaysia, I think it's very much the case that what actually happens, ironically, is the British try desperately to undo indirect rule. That's what they're doing in 46. They say, enough of indirect rule. All you communities are going to come together and speak English and Malay. You're going to have common citizenship. We'll get rid of the sultan. In 2 years, 48, they're defeated. And then even after 48, the British say, no, you can't have communal parties. You must have multi-communal parties and Westminster-style politics. We can't have independence. And the locals go, yeah. And they form UMNO, United Malays National Organisation, which teams up with the Malay and Chinese Association, which is actually a group of people who've been used to managing their own affairs. They're the Chinese who run the Chinese language schools, Chinese chambers of commerce, who provide facilities to Chinese communities in places where the British aren't doing it. So actually, they say, no, we're carrying on with plural society and indirect rule, and that's what we're going to do, and they get away with it. The second point is just to recap on what I said earlier, that both we run some working papers, and I'd be quite happy to hear people, but I'd also be fascinated at some point, I don't care what platform where, but some people were saying, somebody said I last heard from my Emir at Christmas or something, I'm paraphrasing, but it strikes me it would be really, 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 really good if we could persuade somebody from the other side, even if it was somebody who fled Southern Arabia, to record or write some stuff so we can get their view as well. Not because it will necessarily oppose this, but just to get more of that relationship with both sides. That would be fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Some parish notices before we return for drinks. The next seminar in this series is going to be on localization, a rather inelegant phrase, but you know what we mean. Training up local people to take over the administration on independence. And that is going to take place on the 25th of October. I think we already have a number of volunteers, but again, if there's anyone here who is interested in speaking or knows of suitable candidates, please let us know. Next, and this is an awfully long way away, 20th of May next year, 2013, there is a sort of final extravaganza planned in this series, which is going to be entitled Legacy of Empire. And this may be like one of Frank Sinatra's farewell tours. It may not be the very end, and I rather hope it isn't. But that's as far as we can see ahead at the moment. And again, we're putting together the program for that. So if you have a diary that stretches that far ahead, it's 20th of May 2013. Let me end by thanking you all for coming here and participating. It's been another excellent and very valuable witness seminar. Thank you to David Le Breton, his colleagues in OSPA, for putting the program together. And finally, before we retire for drinks, let us thank our panel of speakers for some extremely stimulating.